Hey, what's happening, everyone? Welcome back to the Free to Grow CFO podcast, where we talk all things scaling a D2C brand with a profit-focused mindset. I'm your host, Jon Blair, founder of Free to Grow CFO. We're the premier outsourced accounting and finance firm built exclusively for growing D2C brands. I'm really stoked to have everyone joining today. I got my buddy Adam Siskin on here, co-founder and partner of Platform CPG. He's got a background in the CPG world that extends far and beyond the Platform CPG that we'll get into in a little bit here. But Adam, I feel like we're always texting and chatting on the phone on the side, and it's nice to finally have you here for an actual hour to chat all things scaling a brand. What's happening, man?
I appreciate you having me on here. I know we ping each other a lot on LinkedIn, which is fun. Definitely collaborate on brands. So it's great to get a discussion going and talking about the industry and different facets of it.
Awesome, man. So what we're going to be talking about today, the last few weeks, we've talked a lot about D2C advertising, scaling ad spend. We're going to actually talk about something that's really front and center in the D2C world right now, and that's expanding into retail. And I'm kind of calling today's topic like tips and tricks, do's and don'ts, advantages and drawbacks of expanding into retail. And the reason why I've got Adam on is because Adam in the CPG world, and especially in food and beverage, Adam's got a really robust background in scaling brands within the retail and even more specifically grocery retail. And expanding into retail is something that, depending on the size of your D2C brand, you need to consider expanding into retail at some point. My buddy Ryan Rouse always talks about like, hey, listen, if you're never going to expand into retail, you have to understand that there is a ceiling to how big you can grow your D2C only brand. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to stay D2C, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But know that you are limiting your TAM. And if you want to expand beyond a certain revenue, depending on what your category is, you need to meet your customer in brick and mortar retailers. And so depending on how big you want to grow, depending on your product category, retail absolutely should be considered. But fair warning, it's a different game than D2C. Now, don't be scared and don't be scared to the point where you don't want to ever consider expanding into retail, but understand it comes with different finance challenges, different operations challenges, definitely different sales and marketing challenges. So I've got Adam on today so we can chat about the nuances, the tips, the tricks, the do's and don'ts of expanding into retail, really focusing in on food and beverage and kind of like grocery retail. But before we do that, Adam, I want to have you give everyone a little bit of your background and your entrepreneurial journey so people can understand why, and these are my words, I consider you to be a guru in the grocery retail kind of finance side of the world.
Definitely. I've been in the CPG space for about 8 years. Prior, I was playing finance roles within the healthcare system. I did some private equity, a little bit of tech. And my transition into CPG was actually by accident. I was marketing on Craigslist about 10 years ago from Microsoft Excel and financial modeling and things like that. And I found a programmer that started working for me about 12 years ago and built up this Craigslist business on the side where when I was turning it into 6 figures, I told my boss, I'm out of here. And he laughed at me when I told him why. And, along the way, I actually met my mentor to this day. His name is Eric Skay. So Eric was the CEO of Rayo's when they sold off to private equity, Sovos, about 8-9 years ago. And Eric actually was at a Mets game on Craigslist and messaged me for help. And I built him a financial model. He was actually at the time working with a client of mine today called Riot Energy. It was called T-Riot back then. They changed the name to Riot Energy. So I helped him with some modeling there. And then I went on my own, and the rest was history. I hopped into Rayo's. I worked across him and the CFO, built infrastructure. They sold off to Sovos. I went into Sovos's portfolio more as like a technical analyst. So I didn't have the CPG knowledge and experience in the network. So It was really more like technical finance of what you would think of like with a financial analyst. And so my programmer and I would automate all the different operational functions, whether it was demand planning, production planning, trade planning, report automation. And so I started off in that arena. And then, I would say over the last 8 years, I've touched maybe about 100 brands as a fractional CFO. So I have a firm called Silvercrest Solutions, which does fractional CFO work. There's data visualization, deduction management. And so I've touched a lot of brands from a finance lens. I've placed a little bit of capital as well in Chicago. And then in the last 4 years, I launched what's called the Platform CPG with my business partner, Paul, and another colleague of ours, Jonathan, that are based in New York. And so with the Platform CPG, I really started to learn about the ins and outs of the business, not just from like a financial view of FP&A and all that great stuff, but really started to learn about sales, operations, marketing. And we launched this company 3-4 years ago. We've target kind of well-funded early stage brands that we can accelerate through a roadmap into the market and get commercialized. And it's been quite a journey, but I've definitely learned a lot of aspects of how to enter the space and how to be successful.
Dude, Craigslist stories are the best. One of my best friends I met through Craigslist. In a former life, I was in a thrash metal band that got signed to a record label, put out one record, went on tour, and I found our audio engineer and producer on Craigslist, and we're now like best friends. And I always make a joke. I go, "Hey Matt, you're the coolest person I've ever met on Craigslist, bro." But
I actually met, there was one other, I met the stepdaughter of Anna Wintour on Craigslist too. So Anna Wintour is, the chief editor of Vogue magazine. And so I actually helped launch a company called Masonette with a couple women at a Vogue, and it was a wildly successful company. Next thing you know it, I'm flying to California and Beverly Hills. I'm working with Joyce Azria, who's the daughter of Max Azria from BCBG Max Azria. So as you can see, I'm not a stylish person, but I was working in the fashion industry right around the same time as Rayo. So definitely got a glimpse and touch of outside of the food and beverage vertical doing that.
by the way, for those of you who don't know, Raos, Raos, that's the pasta sauce. If you haven't seen that on the shelves or there's not some in your pantry, you need to crawl out of the hole that you're living in, because Raos is absolutely huge. My wife, when she found out that you worked with Raos, Adam, this is a funny side story. She was like, she's such a fan of Raos that she's like, what? This guy worked with Raos. So anyways, side story. We can get into chatting about D2C expansion into retail now. Look, again, to set the stage of this conversation, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because at Free to Grow, we work with profit-focused D2C brands, right? And we do their bookkeeping and we serve them as fractional CFOs. As we look at scaling a D2C brand profitably, again, depending on your strategy, your target customer, and your product category, there inevitably becomes this conversation that arises where we need to talk about when is the time to expand into retail, and should we consider doing that? And if and when we do, what are we getting ourselves into, right? And so, this is kind of a broad question, but I think a great jumping off point. Like, if a brand comes to you that has a digital, a D2C presence, and they're looking to consider the transition into retail, what are some of the first things that you start asking them about or advising them on before they decide to like dive into retail expansion as a strategy?
Definitely. The first question I ask anyone, regardless of where you're starting, is like, what's the aspiration? So what are your goals of your business and why do you want to enter retail? Because that's going to often drive more specific feedback as to the best way to enter retail, based on your own strategy and goals and what you envision. What I would say overall is like the number one thing that has to be looked into is margin. And that's just true with any product, whether you enter the D2C space, the retail space. Is there a business model that's meant to be had? Because in D2C, you're selling direct to the consumer. So you're skipping about like a 35 or 40 point margin take from the retailer. And then a distributor like a UNFI and Kehe might charge 15 points, where a DSD distributor that goes up and down the street might charge 25. So now all of a sudden you have, over 50% of your selling price to the consumer being taken out by the retailer and the distributor. And so understanding your current margin profile and then at scale where you can be, I think is definitely one of the first areas that I look into to make sure that there's a sound business model entering the landscape.
Yeah. You talk about this a lot in your content. So do I. Like those margin considerations up front rather than after the fact, right? Like I've seen a lot of brands make mistakes where they expand into a channel, like they take on, Whole Foods or Sprouts, a small number of accounts, or HEB or something, and they're stoked because they get into the stores and they're like, let's land in the stores, and then let's figure out how to make money afterwards, right? And what I see happen oftentimes is, and I see this in D2C too, it's not just expanding into a grocery retailer, right? Is that like, hey, let's get some traction and then let's figure out how to turn a profit from a unit economic standpoint. And the reality is, I just see it as honestly next to impossible to reverse the profitability equation if you have bad unit economics to start with, as opposed to like, I would say some of the more savvy brand founders that I work with, they are thinking about unit economic margins from day one, right? Unit contribution margins from day one. And they're literally baking that into how they're thinking about their supply chain costs during the R&D phase and thinking about pricing, right? And they're thinking about that on the front end as opposed to the back end. Do you see similar issues with brands at times? And do you see it, is it possible to like go back and try to raise prices or cut costs to try to retreat to become profitable when you made the mistake of not being profitable or profitable enough in the first place?
Sure. I would say most, if not all, and all might be a little aggressive, but most CPG brands that launch are not going to be profitable. And there's multiple reasons why that might be. A, you don't have economies of scale. So if you're coming out of the D2C space and you've grown a nice size business, call it 20, 30 million, cut that in half, because that's the revenue that you're going to have actually in wholesale. So when you think about like your scale, if you're a $30 million online business, you're really a $15 million wholesale business, because 50 points of margin. So when you just think about like the number of units you're selling, that's kind of how I look at it. And so let's say you start to really get economies of scale at like between like 30 and 50 million, where you can really start to drive down those COGS. I always say that in retail, like you got to have 60 points of margin in the foreseeable future, like further out as you've grown, because your trade spend, let's say, could be 20 points, 15 to 20 points at scale. You might have 5 to 7 points of freight out. You might have 3 to 5 points of warehousing. You got your 5% broker. And so when this all stacks against you, the business model of being in wholesale is like, how do I get, a 10 or 15% EBITDA margin? That's really the ultimate goal. And the only way to get there is with a really, really high product margin that has to be assumed at some point. In the beginning, most CPG brands, again, I'm going to make a generic comment, have around 30 points of margin. So if I go to like, call it, 50 brands, I think like 40 out of 50, maybe higher, will be around 30 points of product margin. And I define product margin as literally your cost of goods sold, so your packaging, raw material, your co-packer, and the price you're going to sell to the retail or to the distributor. So it's not trade spend. Usually you're going to have around 30 points when you're not at scale. Ideally, if you're at like 10 points, you're in huge trouble because you're just going to be burning a ton of money. If you're, a lot higher, great, you're going to be burning less money. But in the beginning, where a lot of brands make a mistake is that they get super excited, like you said, about getting into Sprouts. The number of brands I've seen just get crushed by going into Sprouts early stage is really, really heavy because of the slotting fee. Sprouts is going to ask you for 1 or 2 cases. And if you get a 400 door rollout into all their doors, I've seen brands with like a 6-figure bill where after the fact they go, holy shit, I'm now getting charged back and not seeing any of the revenue collection occur from Kehe, who's the main distributor of Sprouts. So I agree with you that like really looking at the upfront cost of entering a channel or a specific customer and building out that full contribution margin down the line is essential so that you can really appropriately assess cash burn and capital you need to get through the elementary kind of steps of entering retail with the fully loaded COGS and then making your way towards profitability.
Dang, there's too many things we could talk about in there. So I'm going to have to lead us down the list one at a time. Let's start first with what I'm just going to call sales and marketing costs because, well, actually, let me summarize something. 2 points that you made that I think are super helpful that I want to make sure the audience takes away. One, plan on your gross margin being lower, right? Because the price point's going to be lower because the retailer needs to take a margin. And so you've got to be able to bear that. And then number 2, there are sales and marketing costs that are associated with retail. And I think there can be, I've seen this misconception, right? That like D2C is really expensive when it comes to marketing costs, and retail is not as expensive. You know, those retailers already established traffic and they've kind of done the heavy lifting of marketing for you, right? And so your marketing costs are going to be lower than D2C. Not necessarily the case. And that's where I want to go a little bit deeper here is that like, walk me through, you talked about trade spend, you talked about slotting fees, walk through some of the typical sales and marketing costs of working within a retailer and just some of the just rough average benchmarks you can expect to spend in those areas.
Sure. So I'm going to start off with the answer for D2C for food and beverage, which I know is your arena. And why it's important is that you're actually seeing a lot of brands retreat from D2C that are food and beverage specific with a low AOV, which that's kind of your bread and butter. But like it's kind of the same workup is that if I'm selling a product, let's say an energy drink that sells for $2.99 in retail, sometimes you can sell it for a little bit more online. Let's say it's $40. It's going to cost you, if you're shipping with FedEx or UPS, call it like $10 or $12. So 25% of your 25% of your revenue is going to freight. And then, as you know, acquisition costs have gone up increasingly, and maybe 50% is your ROAS. And now all of a sudden you have 75 points of your revenue gone. And so a food and beverage brand is very, very quickly underwater because that shipping or the pick and pack fee that costs you $3 on the $40 order ends up, being significantly a part of your revenue. And so when you look at kind of the wholesale arena and you look at kind of like at the very top, if you have 30 points of product margin to start with, a early stage brand that's in a very, call it aggressive or competitive arena, which I would say a lot of brands are, especially ones that are kind of innovative or trying to disrupt, you're spending like 20 to 30% on trade spend out of the gate. So like your margin could be almost wiped away immediately if you only have 30 points of margin to start. And the reason is the following. One is that you got to go discount and on the shelf. And so when you get like the buy one, get one frees and this and that, depending on the category, it could range from like 10 to 30%, with the majority being closer to like 20, 25, 30, especially the brands that you see hit the headlines on LinkedIn or social media. So you're spending out of your 30 points, let's just say it's 20 points. Your shipping is probably another 10 points because you're not shipping full truckloads. So it's going to cost you around 10% just for LTL. So if my 20 points of trade and my 10 points of shipping, that wipes out my 30 of margin. Now I'm at 0. Now you got your 3PL fees, you got your warehousing, you got your broker. Now you're, further underwater. And so a lot of times a brand's contribution margin, which are all of those expenses lined up, you could be at like negative 10% in the beginning, and you really got to scale until you're product margin goes to 40 points to 45, and then everything gets optimized. Your shipping goes down to 7. Maybe your trade probably won't go down as fast as the other components because you still have to aggressively discount. And then there's marketing. So like with marketing, it's a lot more complicated in the wholesale space because you're really going about shopper marketing, for example, in different facets. So there's demos, there's Instacart, there's digital, online targeting that you can go after certain geographic zip codes. There's, top of funnel where it's brand building with events, and bottom of funnel, which is really conversion that you go after. So your marketing dollars are spread really, really thin across your distribution, which is why I always tell brands to go really narrow and deep to start than doing like a nationwide launch that requires every dollar to be spread out thin across the board.
That makes sense. That's good. That's good advice. Some might already know this and/or have been able to, infer it from like, or from what you just ran through. But what is the definition of trade spend, and what does that money really go towards?
Sure. So trade spend, there's a few aspects of trade spend. One is just pure discounting. So again, when you're lowering the price of a product to the consumer, that's a bulk of trade spend. And so usually you're creating what's called a trade spend calendar for a whole year with a retailer, where you might promote like let's say 2 weeks out of every quarter, you can price promote down for 2-week periods, throughout the year. That's a bulk of trade spend. There's also like early pay discounting. So like if you get paid within 10 days, there's 2% discount. I think UNFI recently actually increased it like closer to 30 days. They called that early spend trade, early pay discount. And then oftentimes you're getting charged back by UNFI and Kehe if you have something shipped late or you short ship. There's also something called an off invoice, where during a period of time, you're giving a discount to the distributors who are supposed to pass that down to independent stores that don't have, true discounting programs. Whether that happens or not is a big debate in the industry. So anytime that you're lowering the price that you're physically getting back, whether it's to a distributor or to the consumer that gets charged back to you, that's what hits trade spend.
Got it. So the point is, when we go from comparing a D2C brand and the contribution margin profile of being the retailer, right, versus going wholesale and selling to either to distributors that sell to retailers or sell direct to retailers, there's all these different deductions and costs that are unique to wholesale, and even some that are unique to grocery, right? That you have to be prepared for, and that your existing margin structure has to be able to bear, right?
Exactly.
And so what's interesting is that this is like you mentioned, you've said a couple things. You're like, hey, this is a general statement. There are caveats to this, but like what I tend to see does really well, in terms of like transitioning from D2C to retail, is a product that already has a very killer gross margin, and some people call it fully loaded gross margin. We call it contribution margin before marketing, meaning that after you back out effectively shipping and fulfillment costs, right, from gross margin. What I have a couple brands that Free to Grow works with, that their gross margin's like 80 to 85%, right? And then after you back out shipping and fulfillment, they're working with like a 70% contribution margin before marketing. Now, keep in mind that lowering the price point for wholesale, right, is going to bring those percentages down, but there's a good amount. You then compare that to their AOV, that 70% times their AOV. The point is they've got a good amount of dollars, right, of contribution margin dollars to work with that they can use to pay for the wholesale, price discount, to pay for the trade spend. But one thing I want to dive into a little bit deeper, you mentioned chargebacks, and there's this whole concept. I actually have a pretty deep wholesale background early on in my career before getting into D2C. So I've dealt with a lot of this stuff firsthand. Like chargebacks and just overall planning, right? There's like demand planning and planning for what you think is going to get ordered versus what actually gets ordered. And then there's cash planning, which includes not just the fact that there's receivables, right, as opposed to collecting your cash right upon sale like you do D2C, but there are also these deductions, chargebacks that you can and should expect when you actually finally receive payments in the wholesale world. So as it relates to cash planning, and specifically deductions and demand planning, what are some of the challenges that a D2C brand needs to be able to weather as they move into wholesale?
Yeah, I would say the planning, there's a lot more variables, and I could be wrong on this, but because I'm not a D2C expert by any means, the brands I work with oftentimes have a lighter D2C profile. I almost call it like a marketing spend because they're not making money on the channel. And so I feel that like at the D2C side, it's like a very calculated approach because the moment that a product is in a warehouse, you don't necessarily need a massive operations team to sit there and ship it to different DCs and locations of distributors. It gets picked and packed. And so when I look at kind of the margin profile of D2C and the margin profile of wholesale, from like the chargeback and trade perspective specifically, I think that one should always expect to be, like I said, around 20% if you are indeed going to be price promoting throughout the year. And then I think, again, like if you take your price to a distributor, when you double that, that's essentially like what the consumer is paying. And so there is a lot of margin loss that happens there. And so my biggest advice for someone going into the wholesale kind of arena, and this is kind of at the platform, like what I do with my partners is like we go really narrow and deep. I want to hit like 10 or 20 stores to start and really crush it in those stores and understand the full contribution margin of everything that's occurring, because it's not black and white out of the gate. You do need to spend on marketing. You do need to activate consumer awareness. And so I really think that narrow and deep approach allows you to kind of dip your toe in without going too deep, taking on a massive financial burden. And that's usually the strategy that I do when entering the retail landscape, is it's not, no one lays out for you, this is exactly what's going to happen. Every contract and every is a negotiation depending on who your customer is.
So on the chargeback side, right, for I don't know if this is the right term. I think this is what we used to call it back in my wholesale days, but like non-compliant shipments, right? Whether that's you screw up the barcode, or some sort of required documentation where the shipment doesn't have, the right unique identification on everything. This is something that D2C brands who are expanding into retail, and by the way, this is not unique to grocery. If you're going to sell into Target, you're going to sell into Walmart, you're going to sell into like non-grocery retailers, these kinds of chargebacks are universal to selling wholesale, regardless of the product category. You have to ship shipments to the DCs or to the warehouses for these retailers in a very specific way because they're large operations, right? They're churning through a ton of inventory that they're receiving into the warehouses. And so you have to have you have to have barcodes, you have to have very specific information. There is even specific information around like how large your pallets can be, how the pallets are loaded. So walk through, I think a lot of DTC brands aren't aware of this. Walk through like some of the common requirements for putting together a compliant shipment that doesn't get chargebacks assessed against it. So the D2C brands listening can like understand what they have to like, what they're going to have to adhere to operationally just to ship shipments in a way that the retailer will actually accept and not charge them back for.
Yeah, so I would say out of the gate, you're going to give your like pallet configurations and pricing and weights and everything like that up front. So when you're like UNFI and Kehe are the two largest distributors, when you onboard with them, there's a meticulous process that you have to go through so that you are providing like all the dimensional and physical weights of your products and configurations. So you're oftentimes not getting charged back specifically for those reasons being off, but more so if a shipment is late. So if you ship something and it's late, you're going to get a fee hit back at you for a late shipment. If your shipment is not in full, you might get a chargeback because you partially shipped. I would say operationally, those are kind of the chargebacks that can occur. They're not necessarily that large as a
Mhm.
percentage of like your overall chargeback. Some like hidden ones are, Kehe, for example, charges you back 2%, what they call is like their BI fee, because they let you have like a portal access. So they're taking
Dang,
2% no matter what. Like
crazy.
then UNFI, it's optional, but I think they're starting to migrate more to it being mandatory. But then also like they're gonna hit you with like 2% this early pay discount, even if they don't pay early. They're just gonna hit you with it until you fight back. And then the moment you fight back and you go through kind of that process, they'll stop doing that. So like if you think about the business model of like a UNFI or Kehe, if they're making 15 points of margin from what they're paying for the product then to the retailer, their business model is like operating on like a couple points of EBITDA. So anytime that they can charge back like a couple points for data or 2 points for early pay, that's a massive amount of additional EBITDA that they're actually taking on, because their product margin, like the brand that's at 30 points, they're starting at 15. And then when they
Mhm.
take out all the costs of their drivers and their trucks and this and that, I mean, they have a couple points left. So the hidden fees are really like that BI fee for the data. If you activate new warehouses, they charge you for those. Each SKU gets charged out of the gate. So there's some upfront costs, but
Mhm.
there's actually like a lot of third-party firms out there that are specifically built to manage deductions and chargebacks. They actually send you like PDF files that are not in tabular Excel format, so you got to convert them and slice and dice. So they make it like really challenging to actually like digest your chargebacks. One company I work with a lot is called Promo Mash. There's a guy named Yuval that owns that company, and Promo Mash has probably one of the leaders in like managing and disputing Kehe and UNFI, and it's an entire business in itself due to like the complexity and how tedious it is to truly manage it down to the invoice level.
Yeah, deduction negotiation or chargeback disputing and reconciliation is a huge effort. I've been through a lot of it in my early days, and it's like it can feel like a losing battle if you don't know what you're doing. And it's funny because so in the Amazon world and the D2C world, Amazon takes there are costs and fees and deductions that you get from Amazon that actually can be disputed and are invalid, but it's really hard to fight back against them and to know which things to fight back against. So there's whole companies out there that you can pay to go get these chargebacks resolved and get those fees back and get what's called damaged goods paybacks, and they just charge you a percentage. So anyways, that this is like super helpful next level advice for any of you D2C operators out there thinking about expanding into wholesale. These are the things that a lot of D2C brands go into wholesale thinking like, hey, we need another channel to capture more TAM and to overall bring our like weighted average marketing efficiency up. And then they don't realize they're getting into some of these things from an operational and even cash flow planning challenges standpoint. Again, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying these are the tips and tricks, right? These are the things you need to know going into it, right? So you can bake these into your plan. So there's something that we've kind of danced around here that is incredibly important when we think about setting up an expansion into wholesale. To make it to set it up so that there's the highest likelihood of profitability. There's the contract that you're negotiating, right, with whoever you're selling to, whether it's direct to a retailer or the contract you're negotiating with a distributor. You're not negotiating a contract with every customer who buys on your Shopify store, right? But there's definitely a contract in place with your customers on the wholesale side of the world, and it bakes in these requirements and these deductions and the rights that your wholesale customer has to deduct all of these charges. And furthermore, the the rights that they don't have, so that you know what to fight back against. When you have a customer, or when you have a client, Adam, that is negotiating a contract with a Kehe, or maybe direct with a grocery retailer, what are some of the major terms you get asked for advice? Like, hey, what do we need to look out for in this contract? What's kind of like your mental checklist of what you've got to make sure you go after in that contract?
Sure. So what I'll say is that there are, like I said, two large distributors, Kehe and UNFI. They're your best friend and they're your worst enemy, because they are the ones that are going to be moving your product nationally across the country. And they also have all the major contracts with the big retailers. And so it's a necessity to use them. You can put together a network of smaller distributors outside of them. It's very tough to do it, and it's more expensive. So overall, like, they have a pretty cookie cutter blanket contract that they're not going to deviate from that much. And so there actually is very little that you can negotiate within the contract, because if you want to do business with them, like, this is what they are going to operate by, from moving your product from point A to point B, essentially. And so the major things, like I said, is this can't be negotiated, but you, like, the 2% discount, you can't get that taken out of the contract that easily. I don't know that I've actually ever seen it taken out. And so while you're not managing that in the contract negotiation, you should definitely do that on the back end. The one thing that I suggest for some brands to look into is FOB pricing. So basically, you can do delivered pricing to Kehe and UNFI, and in the early stages, it can cost you like 10 or 12 points of revenue to deliver your product in pallet size or multi-pallet size shipments. Or you can have UNFI and Kehe pick up from you, and they have much stronger buying power with carriers, where it might only cost you like 6% of your revenue or 7%. So there's a world where you can save like 4 or 5 points. So I think while that's not necessarily a contract negotiation, because you have optionality of where you want to go, definitely something in the contract that you should look for is if you want to price it pickup or delivered. And there's benefits and challenges of both, of course. Outside of that, there are off-invoice promotional periods. They're going to push you to essentially lock in an off-invoice period, which basically means you need to give the product to Kehe or UNFI typically for 15% less during those windows, and supposedly they pass that on to the customer, which is debatable. That I would definitely negotiate hard, because I don't think that the ROI you're going to really see there than actually delivering those kind of savings directly to the customer.
Interesting. That's super interesting. Yeah, and I mean, so the FOB versus the delivered pricing, I like that you called that out. At Guardian Bikes, for a short period of time, we're primarily a D2C brand, but for a short period of time, we sold direct to Amazon on Amazon Vendor Central. They're buying containers of product from us. And, even though we had to drop our price to allow them to have their margin, one thing that we found is that when we had them pay for freight and just deduct it from the invoice, like you said, it was about half of what the cost would have been for us to do it. And it was because they have economies of scale and negotiating leverage, right, with the carriers. And so that was one thing that actually helped take a bit of the sting out of the wholesale versus the retail pricing margin impact. And one step further too, I don't know if you can't really necessarily do this with grocery, but other product categories. We eventually negotiated a direct import program where we were actually having them purchase FOB factory port, like origin port, right? So we weren't paying to have it come from China, come into the US, and then having them pay for shipping from our US warehouse. We had the retailer Amazon pick up the goods and take title to them at the China port, and they could get those goods moved from the China port to their warehouse like for like a third of the cost of us importing them and then fulfilling them direct to Amazon after that. So like for product categories outside of grocery, if over time, and you usually can't do this right out the gate because they want to test your volume, right? They want to give you small tests that are lower risk for the retailer, as opposed to like buying a whole container is a lot more inventory risk that they take on. But if you can over time, if you ship some sort of a consumer product that isn't perishable, if you can, and you're making the product outside of the US, if you can negotiate direct import, and even containers at a time, the economies of scale that you start realizing within wholesale are actually much larger than you might think, if you get the retailer to actually pay for the inbound freight. So I want to shift directions a little bit. I want to talk about financing, right, for wholesale, the wholesale channel versus D2C. So like in the D2C world, when we're talking about debt financing specifically, the two primary needs are for inventory and for ad spend. And inventory is usually the bigger need because there's no receivables to use as collateral, right? Which lenders like a lot more than inventory because it's more liquid, especially if the receivable is a big retailer that's known to pay on time, right? So you have this less liquid asset in inventory, but it is the primary asset that needs to be financed as you're scaling from a debt financing perspective. So there's very specific lenders and specific types of debt facilities that tend to be best for that. But when you're expanding into wholesale and you've got receivables and inventory, and the challenge is you're buying inventory, and you have payment, maybe little to no payment terms with your co-packer, but then you're selling to a distributor or direct to a retailer, and you have like net 90-day terms. You've got to finance that cash gap, right? And debt is a tool that you can use to help you finance that gap. What are some of the strategies or lenders? Just what are some of the things that you think through when you need to help a brand with debt financing to close that cash conversion cycle gap?
Yeah, and that's the biggest difference, as you pointed out, with the cash conversion cycle for D2C versus retail is going to be the AR, right? I think terms with your co-packers and suppliers and things like that on the AP side are going to be the same, as online, but the AR is where it's non-existent online, really, or maybe it's like a 12 or 24-hour ordeal. That's really where retail-based businesses start to get financing, is on the AR. And so, like we discussed with trade spend, if you sell $1,000 of goods, you might only get paid back $800 because of the trade spend. So what the providers out there are going to look at, there's kind of two types. There's factoring, which is a lot easier to do than getting a line of credit. When you factor your accounts receivable, you can actually be like a tiny business doing, 10,000 a month, 5,000 a month, and there's factors out there that will start that early and scale with you. So essentially, the factors are going to look at your cash collection and see what percent of your invoice you're actually collecting because of all the chargebacks and promos that you're running. And so let's pretend it's like 75% that they're going to advance you. Every single time you get an invoice, you can submit it to the factor and they'll wire you that 75%. And then they essentially collect the cash from the customers. So that's one form of factoring that I would say there's a lot of players out there that will do it. There's a lot of regional banks, there's a lot of private companies, but you got to go invoice by invoice. Then there is getting a line of credit. Now, most players out there, debt players, are not providing you a line of credit until you're at least 5 million in revenue. So there's one called Blue Ocean, there's one called Assemble Brands, there's one called Dwight. Those are three major players that are out there that do lines of credits. Most of all three of those primarily have that like $5 million entry point in where they want to give you like $1 million line of credit. And so what they do is they do a similar formula for your line of credit where they'll take, let's say, like 75% of your AR, but then they'll also take like 50% of your COGS, right? And obviously they're going to look at the type of product you have and like, can it sell easily from like a liquidation perspective? And they'll put a borrowing base together with those metrics. The best way to get a line of credit is not when you absolutely need it. So
For sure.
waiting until your cash goes down to zero is not when you want your line of credit, because they're not going to give you one. So a lot of the brands that I work with that are heavily capitalized, we're going out getting lines of credit while we have a super strong balance sheet, so that we go through all of the due diligence and underwriting and get the most favorable terms. Most of these line of credits don't have an unused line fee where you're being charged for not using it. So you can sign up for the line of credit, and then essentially you don't have to pull on it until later down the road when it makes more sense. If you're sitting on 2 years of capital for operating capital, why are you going to spend 15 to 18% on your line of credit voluntarily while you have that much capital in hand? The debt players will give you a reason why you should do it, and you should never use your equity dollars, you should use your debt dollars for inventory. But if I'm sitting on 2 years of cash and I can earn 5.25% in the money market, or I can pay you 18%, I'd rather keep my money in the money market and fund my own inventory, because I can't earn 18% elsewhere, like you'd be paying. And so those are kind of the two profiles of how to get debt in the space.
Yeah, that was a really, really solid overview. And this is just kind of like an FYI to the people listening. Dwight Funding also loves ecom. They were our lender for a time at Guardian Bikes, but they're also really big in food and beverage CPG. So they'll look at both receivables, like Adam mentioned, and your inventory as what's called a borrowing base. And the percentages that generally speaking, 80% of AR, although I've negotiated higher, and generally speaking, the lenders will tell you 50% of inventory, although I've negotiated up to 70. If you have a solid CFO who knows how to work, who knows these lenders and understands how to negotiate, you can get much better rates and just favorable terms across the line of credit structure. I will say I highly recommend, obviously, I run a fractional CFO firm, so I'm biased here, but don't go at raising a significant line of credit without getting some sort of advice from a CFO, even if it's just asking some questions and getting some high level free advice from a potential fractional CFO candidate. It's these lenders, look, there are plenty of lenders out there who are good people, but they're in the business of protecting themselves. And so they're not going to give you the most favorable terms out the gate. They're going to give you their boilerplate cookie cutter contract and a term sheet and contract. And you have to know how to push back, and where you can push back and where you need to hold off, and the lender's not going to move on that. Right. And so that's a spot where we help a lot of brands, because debt financing is, I always say, debt financing is not something that you should rely upon 100% in your capital structure, but it's a tool, and it should be part of your capital structure if you're running a consumer brand. It absolutely should be. There's a place for it, especially when you have asset bases like AR and inventory that expand and contract as you are either seasonally or as you are fulfilling big orders to certain retailers and whatnot. So, well, look, I feel like I got to have you on again, because there's a bunch more that we didn't get to, but we're going to have to land the plane here. Before we kind of shut down this episode, I think I see some Play-Doh back there, right to the right of your right arm. So you're not just a CPG kind of operator and CFO, you're also a dad. I always like to end these episodes talking about something personal. Walk me through, and because I'm asking you this question because I have 3 little kids, and I think we're about the same age, both have very entrepreneurial backgrounds. The biggest thing that I'm challenged with every single day is what I always jokingly say in my content is scaling early stage businesses while also scaling an early stage family, right? Trying to be a good dad and be a good husband. I'd love to just hear a little bit about how you have navigated being a husband and a father while also being an early stage hustler like I am, and just how hard it is to balance those things.
Yeah. I think when you're in the entrepreneurial arena and you're very motivated to grow, it's always on your mind, like business and growth and partners and ecosystem. And so, what I've done is I've made conscious moments in my day to focus on my kids. So I take my daughter every day to her preschool. So 7:30 drop off. I'm there every single day, and then typically I'm picking her up at like 4:30. So I'm grabbing her, I drop her off. I have a nanny. Sometimes I get a couple more emails in. I'm usually logged off at like 5:30. So I might text if someone, in like a Pacific time zone is, reaching out to me, but generally like I'm shutting off my computer and I'm like dedicating that time with my family from like 5:30 to 7 or 7:30. And so I'd say I'm pretty good at like setting boundaries for like active work so that I can have my dinner and things of that nature. Same thing on the weekends. I try not to work on the weekends unless it's like a quarter end. So I think really putting up those guardrails, just like you would with like your own clients and business, setting expectations. I do it very similarly with my family to make sure I can get that time in. Hence, you see some kid stuff in my my back here and here. I have a little play mat sometimes where my daughter can be dropped off. Try to hide it, but didn't quite get all of it in there.
Well, I have a keen eye for it, having a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an 18-month-old. That's the first thing I saw. But behind me, you can't see it. There's all kinds of crazy kid stuff. And usually when I go out my office, it looks like a Target toy aisle like threw up all over my house. That's usually what's going on behind me. But cool, man. Well, this was an awesome conversation. Listen, for everyone listening, D2C operators out there, like, Adam went through a bunch of super helpful next level advice on just what to expect when you're expanding into wholesale. Look, at the end of the day, as scaling your brand up to this point, you're never going to be able to plan perfectly. You're never going to be able to predict everything that's going to happen. But today, Adam took you through some real key areas for you to consider as you're thinking through expanding into retail. It's definitely a strategy that makes sense for D2C brands to do at some point, depending on your aspirations and your goals. But know that you're opening up a vertical in your business that is different than D2C. It doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's bad, but it's different. Be prepared for the difference. So Adam, before we kind of shut it down here, where can people find more info on you, Silvercrest, and Platform CPG?
Yeah, so I'm active on LinkedIn, so you can always DM me, Adam Siskin. I have, two websites, silvercrestsolutions.com and the platformcpg.com, where people can reach out. So I'm always doing, every week I do 3 or 4 calls with founders. A lot of times my relationships are informal in the sense that I'll help with an intro or provide advice, not necessarily within an agenda. As we all know, it's a really tight-knit industry. And so definitely networking and providing guidance as much as I can.
For sure. Definitely reach out to Adam if you have any questions about scaling in the grocery retail landscape. He's my go-to. I'm texting with him all the time, and he's the first person that I introduce people to if they have any sort of challenges with scaling in grocery retail. So that's all for this week's episode. I hope that this was helpful. If you want more helpful tips on scaling a D2C brand, consider following me, Jon Blair, on LinkedIn. And don't forget, if you're interested in learning more about how Free to Grow's e-commerce accountants and fractional CFOs can help your brand scale alongside healthy profit and cash flow, check us out at freetogrowcfo.com. And until next time, scale on.